A single night of unspoken tension shifted everything, forging a connection that defied every professional boundary. Office life was always a predictable cycle. The hum of computers, soft conversations, the occasional project discussion. That's what I expected too, until that one day changed it all. It started like any other Monday, the kind you want to breeze through. But that morning, the air held an unusual weight, the stillness laced with a strange intensity, as if every corner held a secret waiting to be revealed. My boss, Mr. Williams, had been working at the company since before I'd even been born. 60 years old, well-respected, and undeniably intimidating, he was a man of routines. He'd start his day with a coffee that his assistant brought him, spend the first hour checking emails, and then keep meetings brisk and productive. Nothing much ever changed with Mr. Williams. I didn't know much about him outside of work, and frankly, he kept his personal life very private. Yet, there was something enigmatic about him, a mystery that had drawn me in from the start. That day, as I walked into the office, I noticed Mr. Williams was already seated, his eyes fixed intently on his screen, barely glancing up. I mumbled a greeting as I passed by his office, expecting the same brief nod he gave every day. But this time he looked up, his gaze lingering a bit longer than usual, as if he was seeing me for the first time. I felt a little jolt of surprise, unsure of what it meant, if anything. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and composed. Something about the way he said it felt different, like a weight was behind his words. "I'll need you to come into my office later today. There's something we need to discuss." The sentence was harmless enough, but there was an edge to it that I couldn't quite place. I managed a quick nod, shuffling to my desk, but the words echoed in my mind all morning. Was there a problem? Had I overlooked something in my recent reports? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt, and my concentration drifted with every ticking second of the clock. Around noon, the familiar notification chimed on my computer, a calendar invite from Mr. Williams for a meeting in his office in 15 minutes. My heart rate quickened as I stared at the screen, my mind racing. I tried to focus on my work, but my thoughts spiraled, filled with questions. What did he want to discuss? The possibility of a raise, or maybe a promotion, crossed my mind briefly, but it felt too optimistic somehow. His tone didn't align with any good news. I checked my reflection in my computer screen, smoothing out my shirt as I prepared myself, rehearsing a confident smile that I didn't feel. The minutes crawled by, each one adding to the tension building inside me. When the time came, I took a deep breath, rose from my desk, and made my way down the hallway toward his office. His door was partially open, and I hesitated for a second, gathering my composure before finally knocking. "Come in," he called, his tone as unreadable as ever. As I entered, I was met with an unexpected sight. Mr. Williams was leaning against his desk, his usual stern expression softened, almost contemplative. He motioned for me to sit, and I took the seat across from him, trying to mask my nervousness. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite name, but I did my best to ignore it. For a moment, there was silence as he looked at me, his gaze piercing and thoughtful. "You've been working here a few years now, haven't you?" he asked finally. "Yes, nearly 3. I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's been a great experience." He nodded, his lips pressing into a faint smile. "You've done well, and I've noticed your hard work." His words were warm, but his eyes remained intense, searching. "Thank you, sir." I managed, unsure of where this was leading. But he didn't say anything right away, simply watching me as though he was weighing his words carefully. After a moment, he shifted, picking up a small folder from his desk and handing it to me. "Take a look at this," he said, his voice softer now, almost conspiratorial. I opened the folder, my eyes scanning over the contents. A series of files and data, all related to an upcoming project I'd heard whispers about but hadn't expected to be involved in. I looked up, puzzled. "This project is important," he said. "We'll need someone reliable to handle it, someone I can trust." His gaze lingered on me, his expression unreadable. "I think you're the right person for the job." I blinked, taken aback by the sudden weight of responsibility. This was more than I'd expected, but before I could respond, he leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. "There are certain things we'll need to go over in private, details that only a few will know." A rush of adrenaline shot through me as I processed his words. There was a thrill in the idea of being trusted with such a task, a sense of excitement, yet mingled with that excitement was something else, a strange undercurrent I couldn't quite place. His words felt loaded, like there was more behind them than he was saying, but I couldn't afford to second-guess him now. "Yes, of course I'm honored," I replied, managing a smile that I hoped looked genuine. A silence settled between us as he studied me, his expression almost softer now, his gaze still intense, but warmer somehow. It felt like a moment stretched too thin, too loaded, but I couldn't look away. Finally, he spoke again, his voice a bit quieter, almost personal. "I appreciate loyalty, dedication. It's not something you find easily," he said, his tone carrying an unexpected vulnerability. "I had to work my way up, just like you know. Nothing was handed to me, and I've always valued those who understand that." I nodded, absorbing his words. There was something raw about his confession, a glimpse into a part of him I'd never seen. But the moment didn't last long. He straightened, resuming his usual posture as if the lapse had never happened. "We'll begin tomorrow morning. Be here at 8 sharp. The sudden shift took me by surprise, but I nodded, standing to leave. "I'll be here. Thank you for the opportunity." "Good," he replied, offering a faint smile. "I'll see you then." As I left his office, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and tension. Something about our conversation had changed things, made everything feel more charged, more intense. And though I tried to focus on the prospect of the project, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else, something more, was unfolding beneath the surface. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my mind preoccupied with thoughts of the meeting, Mr. Williams's words, his expressions, and the look in his eyes all replayed in my head like fragments of a puzzle I couldn't quite fit together. By the time I left the office that evening, I was both exhilarated and on edge, uncertain about what lay ahead, but strangely drawn to it. The next morning, I arrived 15 minutes early, my nerves buzzing with anticipation. As I stepped into the office, Mr. Williams was already there, his gaze meeting mine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. He gestured for me to follow him, leading me to a conference room away from the usual hustle and bustle of the office. The room was quiet, secluded, the blinds drawn to keep the light dim. It felt almost like we were in our own little world, away from prying eyes. He closed the door behind us, the soft click resonating in the silence. Then he turned to me, his expression softer, almost contemplative. "I want you to feel comfortable with this project," he said, his tone gentler than usual. "I'll be here to guide you every step of the way." "Thank you," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. He stepped closer, just a fraction, but enough to make me aware of the subtle shift in our proximity. "If there's anything you need," he continued, his gaze holding mine steadily, "don't hesitate to come to me. This project, this work is important, but so are you." His words hung in the air, charged with a weight I couldn't define. There was something undeniably powerful in the way he looked at me, a mix of intensity and warmth that left me both nervous and intrigued. My mind raced, trying to process the shift, the unspoken tension that now filled the room, but just as quickly as the moment arrived, it passed. "Mr. Williams cleared his throat, stepping back with a brief nod as though re-establishing the boundaries he had momentarily let slip. "We'll get started on the project specifics tomorrow," he said, his tone returning to its usual business-like calm. "Be ready for a challenging few weeks." I nodded, grateful for the return to professionalism, yet still acutely aware of the undercurrent that seemed to linger between us. As I left the conference room, a strange sense of anticipation filled me. The project was unlike anything I'd worked on before, and the stakes were high, but there was something else, a tension, a mystery that felt both thrilling and unsettling. Something had shifted, and I knew that nothing would be quite the same. The days that followed were unlike any I'd experienced at work. Every morning, I'd arrive a little earlier than usual, partly to keep up with a demanding project, and partly to steel myself for whatever new shift in atmosphere Mr. Williams might bring. He remained reserved, his professionalism untouched, but there was a subtle change, a sense of proximity that hadn't existed before. I felt as though an invisible thread linked us, something that made every conversation feel private, as if we were in on a secret that no one else knew. One Friday afternoon, he called me into his office again, and as I sat across from him, I noticed something in his expression, a hint of weariness perhaps. It was unusual to see any vulnerability on his face, and for a moment, I felt a strange urge to break the barrier of formality that usually separated us. "Long week?" I ventured, my voice soft, testing the waters. He glanced up, surprised, as if he hadn't expected me to ask. For a second, he seemed caught off guard, But then he offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. You could say that. Projects like these take a toll, but that's part of the challenge. There was a pause, and in that quiet moment, his gaze held mine longer than it should have. I felt a sudden warmth in my chest, a pulse of something unfamiliar but undeniably present. Breaking eye contact, I glanced at the papers on his desk, trying to refocus. I'll make sure everything is prepared for Monday, I said, hoping the slight tremor in my voice didn't betray the tension building inside me. Thank you, he replied, his tone softer. I appreciate your dedication. Not everyone would be willing to put in the extra hours like you have. I nodded, unsure of what to say next. The silence was thick, lingering between us like a question left unasked. Just as I was about to excuse myself, he cleared his throat, pulling out a file from his drawer. I think it's time you took a closer look at some of the details here, he said, passing it to me. This is sensitive information, confidential to a select few in the company. I took the file, glancing at the neatly organized data. It was indeed unlike anything I'd handled before, a level of trust I hadn't anticipated. I'll be careful with it, I replied, feeling a mix of pride and responsibility. As I stood to leave, he stopped me. Wait, would you be able to stay for a bit longer today? I'd like us to review the initial stages together. Of course, I replied, suppressing a sigh of relief. Despite the weight of the project, I felt an inexplicable eagerness to stay, as if part of me didn't want the day to end just yet. We spent the next hour in a back and forth, diving deep into the intricacies of the project. Mr. Williams's expertise was clear, but so was his patience, his willingness to explain things I might not have fully understood. At some point, we both leaned over the desk, poring over a particularly complex chart. Our elbows brushed, and he didn't pull away. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I looked up, only to find him watching me with that same intense gaze. It was as if he could sense the subtle shift in the air, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for days. For a moment, the space between us felt smaller, charged with a mix of curiosity and something else, something unspoken that neither of us seemed ready to address. Clearing his throat, he sat back, breaking the moment. You've done well so far, he said, his voice steady. If you keep this up, there may be more opportunities like this down the road. I managed to smile, though my heart was still racing. Thank you, I'll do my best. When I finally left his office that evening, the streets were quiet, and I could still feel the ghost of his gaze lingering in my mind. It was unsettling, yet oddly comforting, as if the line between professional and personal had blurred in a way I couldn't quite define. The next week, things took a new turn. Mr. Williams invited me to lunch, not in the break room or the nearby cafe where colleagues usually gathered, but to a quiet, dimly lit restaurant a few blocks from the office. It was far from what I'd expected, and as we sat across from each other, I found myself feeling oddly vulnerable, the familiar office walls replaced by a more intimate setting. I thought it would be nice to get out of the office for a bit, he said, his tone casual yet careful. We've both been under a lot of pressure lately. I nodded, my mind racing. It's true, this project has been intense, but it's rewarding. I appreciate the chance to work on something so challenging. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. It's rare to find that kind of commitment these days. Most people want the rewards without the effort. There was something in the way he said it, a hint of admiration perhaps. The conversation drifted, moving away from work and touching on personal anecdotes. Things I'd never expected him to share. Stories of his early days in the industry, his travels, his struggles to balance work with a semblance of a social life. It was strange hearing these things from someone who'd always seemed so composed, so untouchable. And as he spoke, I realized I was seeing a different side of him, a side that was just as real, but far less guarded. I found myself drawn in, hanging on to his every word, fascinated by the complexity beneath his usually stern exterior. Just as we were finishing, he glanced at his watch. We should head back soon, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. But I wanted to say, I value the trust you've shown in this project. It means a lot. There it was again, that subtle shift in tone, the way his eyes seemed to linger. My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly gathered my things, offering a polite smile. Thank you, Mr. Williams. I feel lucky to be part of it. The walk back was quiet, almost reflective. I felt a strange sense of clarity, as though some invisible line had been crossed, and I couldn't quite place how I felt about it. Over the next few days, I became hyper aware of his presence, the way his gaze would linger just a second too long, the occasional brush of his hand as we passed documents between us. One evening, as we were wrapping up in the office, he surprised me by offering to give me a ride home. It was late, and the offer was more than reasonable, but I hesitated, unsure of what accepting it might imply. "It's no trouble," he said, his tone casual. "I'd feel better knowing you got home safely after all the extra hours." The ride was quiet at first, both of us seemingly lost in our thoughts, but halfway through, he broke the silence. "Have you ever thought about where you want to go in this field?" he asked, his voice thoughtful. "Not just the immediate future, but long term." The question caught me off guard, but I appreciated the sentiment. "I suppose I'd like to move up, maybe take on a role that involves more strategic planning, but honestly, I'm still figuring things out." He nodded, glancing at me briefly before turning his eyes back to the road. "You have potential," he said. "Sometimes it's just a matter of recognizing it." There was an intensity to his words, a certainty that made me feel strangely self-assured, as though he saw something in me that I hadn't yet realized. I wanted to say something in return, to express the gratitude and the mix of emotions building inside me, but I stayed silent, allowing the moment to hang in the air. When he finally pulled up to my building, I thanked him, my voice softer than I'd intended. He gave a brief nod, a slight smile playing on his lips. "See you tomorrow." As he drove away, I stood there watching until his car disappeared around the corner. The night air was cool, grounding, and yet I felt an unfamiliar warmth, an excitement I couldn't quite explain. It was as if a door had opened, revealing a path I hadn't noticed before. Over the next few days, our interactions became more frequent, each one tinged with the same undercurrent of tension. I found myself looking forward to them, to the quiet moments in his office, the shared glances that felt almost like secrets. Yet there was something undeniably tense about it, an awareness that grew with each passing day. A line had been crossed, and while neither of us acknowledged it, we both seemed to understand it. The air between us was thick with possibilities, each one as intoxicating as it was unsettling. And though we'd never spoken about it, we both knew things would never return to the way they were before. Something had shifted, and whatever was coming next, it was bound to change everything. The days felt like they were passing in a slow blur, yet each moment was heightened, charged with something that felt both electric and unspoken. Our glances lingered, and conversations grew quieter, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. It was as if we were both teetering on the edge of something we couldn't quite name, each interaction pulling us closer to that uncharted territory. One evening after hours, I found myself alone in the office again. The others had left, and I'd stayed behind to finalize a few last-minute adjustments on the project. My focus was intense, but it shattered the moment I heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, I saw Mr. Williams standing in the doorway, watching me with that same quiet intensity that had become so familiar. "You're here late," he remarked, his voice carrying a warmth that felt strangely intimate in the stillness of the empty office. I managed to smile, glancing at the screen. "Just trying to make sure everything's ready for tomorrow's meeting. The project has to be perfect." He nodded, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. The soft click of the door made my heart race, though I couldn't say why. The silence wrapped around us, thick and heavy, and as he walked over to my desk, I felt a shiver of anticipation. "I wanted to thank you for all the work you've put into this," he said, his voice low. He stopped beside me, so close I could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. "It's not often you find someone so dedicated." The table. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a shiver down my spine, a reminder of everything we'd shared in that quiet car ride, and everything we still had yet to explore. And in that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever risks we might face, this was something I didn't want to let go of. The boundaries we'd crossed, the closeness we'd found, it was all too real, too meaningful to ignore. We'd found something rare, something hidden in the quiet spaces between words and glances. And as I looked at him, I felt a sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something more. The following weeks passed in a blur, each day filled with a new layer of quiet moments and careful glances that only we understood. It was as if we'd created a world of our own, a hidden space within the office walls where every look, every touch held meaning. Though unspoken, there was a rhythm to the way we moved around each other, a dance that balanced on a fine line between the familiar and the forbidden. But the closer we grew, the harder it became to keep up the facade of normalcy. I felt it whenever we were alone in his office, the way his hand would linger just a moment too long on my shoulder, or the way his gaze would soften when he thought no one was watching, and every time I left his office, I was left with an ache, a longing for something more, something beyond the constraints of office walls and closed doors. One evening, after the rest of the office had cleared out, I lingered behind to finish a report. The silence was comforting, but the faint sound of footsteps approaching made my pulse quicken. I didn't need to look up to know it was him. I could feel his presence, the way it filled the room, making the air feel charged, alive. Still here? His voice was soft, warm in the quiet. Just finishing up, I smiled, setting my pen down and glancing up at him. He walked over, stopping just beside my desk, his expression thoughtful. "You work too hard," he murmured, his gaze holding mine. "Coming from you, that's quite a compliment," I replied, a playful tone slipping into my voice. He chuckled, the sound low and rich, and for a moment, it felt as though the walls around us had faded, leaving just the two of us in this small, quiet world we'd created. Then, with a soft sigh, he leaned in, his hand reaching out to gently cup my face, his thumb tracing a line along my cheek. "It's strange," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight I couldn't quite name. "I never expected to feel this way." The vulnerability in his words made my heart ache, and without thinking, I reached up, placing my hand over his. "Neither did I whispered. For a moment we stood there, wrapped in the silence, each of us caught in the gravity of the other's gaze. And then, as if drawn by a force beyond either of our control, he leaned down, his lips meeting mine in a gentle, lingering kiss. It was soft, filled with a tenderness that seemed to hold all the words we hadn't dared to speak aloud. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his breath mingling with mine. It was a simple moment, but it felt like everything a promise, a confession, a question. "Let's get out of here," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, we gathered our things, slipping out of the office and into the quiet streets outside. The night air was cool, grounding, and as we walked side by side, I felt an unfamiliar sense of freedom, as if I'd left a part of myself back in that office, a part that no longer belonged to me. We found ourselves in a small cafe, tucked away in a quiet corner, shielded from the eyes of anyone who might recognize us. The conversation was soft, filled with laughter and stories, and as we talked, I felt the last remnants of tension melting away. For the first time in a long time, we weren't colleagues or even acquaintances. We were just two people sharing a moment that felt entirely our own. "Tell me something," I asked, my voice soft as I looked across the table at him. "What made you stay so late in the office tonight?" He hesitated, his expression turning thoughtful. "Honestly," he said finally, his gaze meeting mine, "I wanted to see you." The simplicity of his words took my breath away, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a quiet joy that settled deep in my chest. It was strange, the way he made me feel grounded yet exhilarated, as if every moment was something worth holding on to. As the night wore on, we eventually found ourselves back at my building, standing at the entrance in the dim glow of the streetlights. There was a comfortable silence between us, a shared understanding that needed no words. "This feels different," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression softening. "It does." He reached out, his hand finding mine, his touch warm and reassuring. "It feels like something worth exploring." I looked up at him, searching his face for any hint of doubt, but all I saw was sincerity, a quiet resolve that matched the fluttering in my own chest. I squeezed his hand, feeling a rush of certainty, as though everything that had led up to this moment had been building to something more. "Let's take it one day at a time," he said, his tone gentle. "We don't have to figure everything out tonight." There was wisdom in his words, a reminder that whatever we were building didn't need to be rushed. I nodded, grateful for the reassurance, and together we lingered in that quiet moment, savoring the simplicity of being close. In the days that followed, the unspoken understanding between us became a steady presence, a quiet pulse that colored every interaction, every shared glance. We didn't need to define it or explain it, it simply was, and that was enough. The world around us carried on, the office bustling with its usual rhythm, but within that familiar space, we had carved out something uniquely ours. Each day was like a small step forward, a new layer added to the bond we'd built, a quiet promise that neither of us had to speak out loud. There were challenges, of course, Moments when the line between work and personal blurred, when the demands of the project pulled us back into the roles we'd been so careful to maintain. But even then, I felt his presence beside me, a reminder that whatever we faced it together. One evening, as we wrapped up another late night at the office, he looked at me with that familiar warmth, a smile playing on his lips. "We've come a long way," he said, his tone soft, almost reverent. I nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude, a sense of contentment I hadn't known I'd been missing. "We have." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, a simple gesture that held a world of meaning. And as we left the office that night, stepping out into the cool embrace of the evening, I knew that whatever lay ahead, whether it was challenges, uncertainties, or simply the quiet moments that defined our days, it was a journey I wanted to take, one step at a time, side by side.